My name's Rob Young. I'm hosting this talk on behalf of The Wire magazine, one of the media partners here at Big Ears. There's some really great talks happening in this space, actually. I really recommend keeping an eye on the whole program. There's like theme panels on folk music in the modern era. There's a great talk tomorrow about music in a time of rage. I'm going to be talking with Alvin Curran about Pauline Oliveros here tomorrow, so do keep your eyes on the talks schedule. This event now is based around a book written by Jace Clayton, aka DJ Rupture. He wrote this book, Uproot, which came out last summer, I think. And there it is. So Jace is going to give us a kind of a walkthrough of some of the ideas and with some images and sounds from his amazing travels in music and digital culture around the world. So we'll take a look at that, and then I'm going to rejoin him on stage, and we'll have a chat about it. Okay, take it away, Jace. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And thanks for coming to listen to people talk on an early Saturday morning. I appreciate that. And so, yeah, I think I'm going to start just with reading the first page and a half of this book to sort of give you a context of what it's about. And then I'm going to discuss three interesting examples of voice, which don't actually specifically appear in this book, but I think it'll all give you some of the spectrum of questions and things that interest me. I kind of wish we could just be sitting in a circle, but this is what it is. So yeah, it's called Travels in 21st Century Music and Digital Culture, and this is how it begins. The early 21st century will be remembered as a time of great forgetting. As so many of our ways of communicating with each other and experiencing the world translate to the digital and dematerialize, much is lost, and many new possibilities emerge. When people look back 100 years from now, this time will be seen as a crucial turning point when we went from analog to digital. Much of what is special about this transition gets articulated by music, those waves of magic that happen when the human spirit joins with technology to create vibrations that enchant us, regardless of age or language, afloat between novelty and tradition, and always asking to be shared. Zeitgeist heartbeats. A 3-minute pop song can stop time, as sure as a 3-second sample can conjure up decades of history. Music clocks the speed of our age, then runs it down or winds it up or makes it funky as the moment requires. In the last 20 years, digital technology has without question changed all aspects of music. Inspiration, production, distribution, performance, reception, everything. Some of this has been for the bad, but plenty has been for the good. And these profound electronic transformations are only part of the picture. When I reflect on my life since I started DJing internationally in 2000, my head starts to spin. Who knows how many cities and time zones I've passed through? My wife sometimes calls me the jet lag king. I've easily taken 1,000 flights, and in each destination I've been surprised by on-the-ground details that complicate or outright contradict the standard media narratives about how music is changing. The more I traveled, the more I saw how the ways in which we make, access, and value music have shifted, creating new social meanings that get at the heart of what it means to be alive in our wired and unpredictable time. And so, in this book, well, let's just leap into it. I would like to talk about this guy and what you can see here. I don't know, it's kind of bright, but there's a person in an astronaut suit who's about to slam a sledgehammer into the ground, and there's an array of microphones which stretches off into the distance. So this is up by the North Pole, and what's happening is called reflection seismology. And basically, this is a method that scientists use to look for underground resources, to look for oil. It's like underground sonar. So you slam a sledgehammer, or you light off a stick of dynamite, and then an array of microphones embedded in the earth record the sounds as they echo and reverberate through all the material. And then you take all this computational equipment, you take computers, and you analyze it to get a sort of picture of what's underground. And this, is the kind of the current interface for the software that does this reflection seismology. And this is interesting to me because the same guy who invented and sort of refined this technique for finding oil deposits underground, of course, he made a ton of money. He sold his company to Halliburton and Exxon. And then he went on to make this piece of software, which is Autotune vocal processing. And it's just so, this is one of these things which fascinates me. You know, this came out in 1997, and the situation it emerged from was so specific. You have an array of underground microphones listening to literal explosions, and then being analyzed by supercomputers, all in the service of resource extraction. So it's this lots of inhuman and very strange circuitry, which then, you know, he says, oh, hey, I can take a lot of the mathematics, a lot of the algorithms, and just sort of transpose it into another world entirely. This guy, Dr. Andy Hildebrand, he loves music. And so he does lots of the same sort of wave analysis and all these techniques, but with Autotune, of course, it becomes sensible to us. It enters into us at the most human level, which is at music, at the level of the voice. And for those of you here's one of my favorite Autotune tracks, but the way I see it, this is a strange path that begins with this. It begins with looking for oil, and it ends up with stuff like this. This is Southern Moroccan Berber conservative wedding music, sung by Hafida. And the thing is, all of her songs sound like that. They all have that level of extreme, hyper auto-tune in the voice. Really blew my mind. And so, for example, in one of the chapters in the book, I said, well, this type of music has been happening in South Morocco since the early 2000s, since before T-Pain and Florida popularized it, since before Auto-Tune the News and all of that. And so I just wanted to find out why. I'm like, how come this very kind of slow to change music ended up embracing this global technology so passionately and then kept using it? It's still quite popular. She's actually stopped doing music, but she's still very widely bootlegged within that circuit. And one sort of clarification I like to make about this particular software, of course, people know, or Cher's Believe in 1998 was the first song to really make use of that crazy vocal sound, because this was designed to just correct wrong notes. So say you're playing a guitar and you hit an off note, or you're recording with a singer and he or she flubbed up a note, you could then go in after the fact and bend it almost imperceptibly to correct it. And it wasn't until Cher's producers realized that if you push the software a bit too far, you could get that very kind of flamboyant and dramatic effect. And so I like to call the sort of pop usage of Autotune, where you can hear it, as cosmetic, and then I like to call all other uses of it as corrective, when you're sort of hiding that mistake. And this is one of my favorite examples of corrective Autotune. Listen carefully, you hear it in the sort of opening notes. It's a sour, sort of lemony aspect that enters into his voice. Here we go.
And now to honor America, 6-time Grammy Award winner and member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Billy Joel.
at the dawn's early light, what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, while the ramparts we watched was so gallantly streaming, and the rockets spread glare, the bombs bursting in air, yet prove through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the
Wow. Interactivity. Yeah, and this clip interests me so much because, of course, the next day, message boards exploded. Billy Joel was using Autotune, and his publicist issued a statement that they didn't know that it was in use, and all of these things. But to me, it points to all the sort of the anxiety around voice and around the individual. And as you can see in this clip, an extraordinary amount of editing goes on to create this idea of a notion, of a nation, and of a just game. You cut to this idea of empire, the sort of soldiers in Baghdad. You have the mother instructing her son to salute, sign language, these close-ups, sort of dramatic slow motion close-ups, and of course the musician at the heart of it. But it's the fear that Billy Joel might give a wrong note, that he might be sort of too soulful, that he might slip into this error, and that's what made some engineer at some point in the chain decide to put on the Autotune. And one of the reasons I'm so attracted to this particular piece of technology is precisely because it operates between voice and electronics, between the sort of networked system around us and the human soul. And Autotune messes with ideas about virtuosity. There's a long history of people saying, oh, the soul singer, if you can speak, you are a person. And Autotune interrupts it in a very strange electronic way. And in a lot of pop music, I feel like it's sort of recognizing that. You're saying, well, we're in this hyper-connected dynamic system, and the individual voice no longer has the sort of the subjective power that it once had. Things are changing. The price of your rent might be affected by the price of oil that might be a result of things that happened in Baghdad 10 years ago or 15 years ago. It's a very strange new world. And all these different uses of Autotune, some of which I trace and discuss in this book, kind of get at the heart of what that means. And I also like to call Autotune the first musical instrument of the 21st century. And the reason for that is because it was always software. Before that, if you had a piece of equipment, it'd be, even if it was an electronic synthesizer, a Moog, or guitar, or whatever, it would be something physical. In order for it to spread globally, there were all these barriers to transit, there were all these issues of scarcity. But one of the reasons why, as a pop phenomenon, Autotune went and spread all around the world so quickly was that people could just download it. So for the first time, you had this piece of software that not only was it not limited to that sort of idea of physical scarcity or abundance, but it was actively listening to us. Just like you saw with the oil software, Dr. Andy Hildebrandt's algorithms had a very complicated relationship to the voice. So the more out of tune you sing, the more Autotune's going to push back and activate its circuitry. But the more sort of standard and flat and robotic you sing, the less it's going to activate. So we're in this very kind of interesting space between friction and pleasure, where all of what it means to be human is being processed, analyzed, and spat back at us by electronics. And here's a piece. I'm gonna play a quick clip by this is a Moroccan video artist named Miriam Benani, and this is something she posted to her Instagram feed on January 21st. It's short, so I can play it again. Make sure you don't miss any of the details. Yes, it's a bit of sort of American realism at the moment. And this speaks to me so much because at a very basic level, it's saying, you know, there are many times when language isn't enough, when you kind of need to scream and you need to have this excess to communicate how you feel. And so she was enacting that. And I like what she's doing with the edits here. It's taking the TV camera angles, but sort of chopping them up so they become a bit queasier as this is happening. And of course, she's playing with this idea of the chorus, like what does it mean to sing in unity? What would it mean to scream in unity? But more importantly, to me, it really kind of, you know, pushes the button of this political moment because we're saying so much of what is political discourse in America right now feels governed by the kind of irrational, full of affect, anti-fact, hyper-visual dialogue and discourse. And so with this piece, Miriam is saying that to sort of speak to the dominant political language right now, you need to enter into some very strange places and make some very unusual connections. But this piece, of course, it's humorous and kind of amazing, but there's a little piece of optimism for me, and it's this moment, you know, when the lady, you can see the little loading wheel spinning in the center. It's like this, and the lady's scream gets glitched out. And of course, Miriam programmed this into it. But to me, this kind of talks to this idea of there's something about the 24-hour news cycle where we're constantly asked to react. You know, there's this emergency, there's this happening. Outrage is almost constant. And that leads, at least for me, that's a media diet which exhausts me. And this notion that the emergency is now and I must respond, and there's something very debilitating about it. And at the same time, there's no possible way I can unplug. You know, I need to be on Twitter and Instagram. I need to check the RSS feeds. Like exiting isn't an option. But what this loading moment that Miriam inserted into the video suggests is that even in the midst of this hyper hot-wired time, we can take a bit and let it load, and let the sort of breakages and actual physical distance in this information system, let it breathe. And it's not going to be like a pause of quiet. It's a strange moment of respite, which might sound like a scream or a glitch. But this idea that by modulating and sort of taking a step back from the dominant time, the dominant info time, could be a really interesting way to kind of let things breathe and begin to think about what the next steps might be. So the last example I'm going to talk about before Rob and I open up the conversation is this is one of the Greek islands. This is Lesbos, the Moravia refugee camp. And throughout the course of researching Uproot, I just got in touch with a lot of artists and a lot of sort of professors and educators. And I was actually researching the 1932 Cairo Congress, a fairly obscure ethnomusicological gathering. And one thing led to another, and then very quickly I found myself in touch with a woman who was working as a humanitarian translator at one of these camps. And since so much of the themes in the book are thinking about these sort of digital exchanges and what does voice and expression mean when everything is capable of being shot around the world in a second. With the flip side of that, I was very interested in thinking about all the moments when sounds travel but people can't. All the ways in which the sort of new fluidity of content, whether it's a video clip or a festival or whatever, that new fluidity can lead to displacements or can sort of reinforce power imbalances between different parts of the world. And so I just wanted to end with this clip. Basically, Rebecca Wolf was the one who recorded it at my request. I said, hey, can you start just taking some cell phone videos? How are refugees socializing on the island of Lesbos? And so most of what she sent me was just a cappella recordings, because as it turns out, most of the people who showed up there had no instruments or they'd tried to travel with something and had gotten lost. And it was a very interestingly international spot. People from like 12 different countries had gathered there. But this one particular clip you're going to hear, it's a Kurdish gentleman who's playing a saz. And just hearing this clip made me think, like, what does it mean to have a cell phone but not a country? And so here it is, a piece of music. This was recorded about 13 months ago now. On for about 15 minutes. But just in closing, my favorite moment in this recording occurs later on. It's a solo. You can hear people talking, you can hear laughter, all these sorts of things. But at one point, a Moroccan guy picks up a drum, a darbuka drum, and starts to play along. But he can't. He's out of rhythm. He gets the rhythm wrong. And so it's this wonderful instance where I'm like, okay, the power of music. He wants to participate. He wants to create this moment of community and shared space and grievance, but he can't because of these musical incompatibilities. And he tries for a few bars, and then he realizes that it's not going to happen, that there are subtleties within this Kurdish tradition that are not apparent to all the rhythmic, the sort of polyrhythmic world that he's coming from, and so he stops. And so that moment of trying to communicate via music, knowing the necessity, but still sort of facing those challenges, and then the laughter that emerges, is a really kind of beautiful and poetic instance within this. So I think, I was kind of fast forward, but I think we now have a chat, and we can expand it a bit.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, that was, even just that kind of little core sample gave an amazing sense of the sort of, the fascinating lines of connection that you're managing to draw with this work, from from Billy Joel to the migrant camps of Lesbos is, quite an achievement. It seems to me that one of the great values this book has right now is that certainly in the kind of a lot of the discourse around popular music at the moment, and especially in mainstream press, it very much seems to circulate around ideas about nostalgia, about kind of retrospectiveness, about like coming to terms with 50 or 60 years of rock history in a very, very broad sense. At a time when the whole delivery system of music, the digital delivery system, is about kind of, basically in streaming terms or iTunes terms, one window where you turn on the tap and you get the entirety of of the human output of music, nearly, for $10 a month or something. What I think you've done with Uproot is to sort of really re-energize a whole way of thinking about music on a, as this very, very sort of dynamic force on a global level, and you've gone into areas of the world that, from a music perspective, are often thought of as obscure. Why that is, I really don't know. Perhaps we can go into that. But can you talk a bit about at what point did your travels as a musician began to become, you thought, I could get a book out of this, in crude terms?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago. And it was the point when I realized, I was like, wow, when I started DJing internationally, in 2000, it was crates of records. It was physical weight. And then now, 10 years later, it'd be totally possible to tour with a USB stick. And so just that moment of thinking, oh, how I'm accessing music and how I'm interacting as I travel around the world has changed so dramatically. And then it was like, not only that, but I've sort of witnessed, like it's not just my travels become lighter, but it's, as you say, streaming hits. It's like the ways in which music globalized and digitized so fast. But thinking of, okay, I've been a working musician through those years, so I've lived those changes, both, of course, thinking about it, but then also having the time to sort of reflect on it. And so starting about 5 years ago, I was like, well, let's turn this into a book, let's, because so much of all those changes, they're happening on many different scales at once, and I wanted to really try and communicate the sort of the breadth as well as the depth of it, and thinking, okay, being a DJ and being invited all over the world gives me access to these places and scenes, which is sort of most music journalists couldn't get. So I said, okay, well, let's really kind of dive into that.
And what was the region you think that sort of particularly kicked it off for you? Would it be kind of North Africa, or I mean, what was some of the most kind of exciting points on the globe for you where you felt really sort of strong energies happening?
Yeah, there was this whole sort of like they called it new cumbia moment in like 2006, 2007, 2008, which was sort of fascinating. I got to see firsthand how like MySpace was helping kids in Buenos Aires connect with each other. And then I got to travel down there and write about it. And I was like, oh, and then I saw very quickly how that'd be like a night where some German DJ's doing it, and then something opens up in Chicago. And then a few years later, I was in actually Monterrey, North Mexico, and just, again, I was there to play a party, but then afterwards my friend Toy Selecta was like, there's a teen rave happening in downtown Monterrey Sunday afternoon, let's go. I was like, okay, and we go and we had our minds blown. And then, of course, being able to travel in the years after that to North Africa, to Morocco and Cairo, that sort of solidified my ideas of like, okay, this can crystallize in a book in an interesting way. There are all these places which are very far-flung, but if I can discuss them each in detail, there'll be all sorts of resonances between these different types of new electronically enabled youth culture happening in different places.
And it's really, I mean, you talked a little bit there about the move from analog to digital. I mean, I've heard people talking about, a certain generation, probably me, partly, as being a digital migrant. I think I'm probably a bit older than you, but I mean, I do remember the moment like in the early 90s when I was just starting to work for The Wire, and I remember seeing the internet for the first time when it was, and I mean, it sounds so corny now, and I know there are people at this festival who were born probably later than the time I'm talking about, which is incredible. But, I still remember the wonder of that moment of seeing somebody doing a live chat with somebody in San Francisco from London, and the sort of the mind-blowing nature of that collapse of distance. But I mean, you're probably largely talking about, young people in all over the world who, that sense of the incredibleness of digital culture is not even a factor. It's just there. It's just part of life, and there's no sense of that. Oh well, yeah. the digital factor is nothing special in a way. It's just part of the fabric of the way people manage their lives and manage the music, and especially the kind of the idea of the cell phone, the way that's used in the North African Maghreb, for example. I mean, that seemed like a really interesting phenomenon. I mean, what impact do you see that? You know, that. I mean, at what point do you feel that you were sort of born, that you're completely within the digital age, or do you feel like you're probably sort of like a little bit on the cusp there as well? But I mean, I was sort of like educated in a very traditional analog sort of, you know, literary format in a way that had no sense of what was coming.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I feel I'm one of these. To speak to your early comment, like there's not a lot of musical nostalgia within me, and not even a lot of respect for like musical classics, and so I've always had this suspicion, you know, I'm like, the second you start talking about the best music, that means the music is totally dead. Suddenly it's taxonomies and classifications, and you're just like, ah. And so that push towards music as something which is constantly, which is an active discourse, kind of leads my curiosity. And so I think in that sense I transitioned well into the digital, but that said, it does open up all these questions, and it's less about like media, and it's almost, it turns to me questions about history, and like the ways in which streaming services, for example, sort of, they kind of, history's on the outskirts, if that. You know, you're only seeing the front cover of the release. Even the album sequences can be hard to access on Pandora or Spotify or whatever it is. And the thing that comes with this incredible abundance of musical access to music via YouTube and stuff like that is it's the flip side of that is like there's no more timeline, and then how do you respond to that? And then how do you respond to the fact that all these areas, all these sort of containers for culture, they're almost entirely corporate owned. You know, it's like Spotify, Google, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, so then in the sense, on the one hand, there's a sense of like, what incredible possibility. Like today is the best day ever to be a musician or to be listening to music, because there's so much of it, there's so many new conversations. The type of connections that are being made now are not going to go away. It's not going to close in that sense. But at the flip side, it's just like, yeah, I remember back in 2006, a service called iMeme. A lot of what was going to become Chicago Juke and Footwork was on this like cool social network called iMeme, and then one day MySpace bought it and deleted it. So one day to the next, it's gone. This whole archive, you know, and so that like early Rashad material, all this stuff. So.
Yeah, it's interesting you bringing up the corporate aspect, because you know, when you showed that amazing North Pole acoustic survey, and then you know the connection with Autotune. I mean, I was it probably wasn't the intention of that guy, I've forgotten his name, who invented Autotune, but you know, it did make me think about. I mean, I was at a sort of music industry conference a few weeks ago, where there was so much talk about. Kind of automation and sort of robotics even coming into both the world of A&R, the kind of algorithms being used to sort of like determine what's the perfect song, to, you know, like being used in songwriting, being used, of course, also in big data mining of everything you listen to via Spotify and streaming services, and it's sort of all about, you know, kind of creating this environment for listening which sort of shapes itself around your perceived tastes and interests, and therefore kind of closes you off in a certain sense to new experiences. And of course we're seeing that via social media, which of course can be abused in a political sense to create a sense of consensus or a certain conversation around you. And so, you know, that bringing up that thing about that connection with sort of like big business and then into culture via Autotune, just sort of brought all those slightly sinister connections home. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on any of that.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I don't need to wonder, I know you do.
Yeah, it really is. And of course, you know, there's a chapter in my book called Red Bull Gives You Wings. And I was trying to be very explicit about thinking, okay, like, this is now a factor. You know, like this is just present, and from brands love siding up to DJs and different types of new music culture, sponsors, et cetera, and so many of the sort of the platforms and places where we can do our thing have a direct corporate line. And to me, it turns back. It's like it's interesting because it's no longer about a discourse of selling out, but it is about where you want to create culture. You know, like what do you want to? What are the ecosystems you want to see exist in the world and thrive? And how does that work with memory? How does that work with your discography? How does that work with the space where you can feel good dancing all night long? And so that's one of the things I talk about in the book is this idea of a distributional aesthetics. Like not only how your music reaches the people, how that music circulates is itself a sort of an aspect of one's art that hopefully gets more and more considered. It's not enough to be like iTunes, bam, I got the premiere on Spotify, I'm gonna, things like that. It's like, no, I'm hoping to see more and more artists who are interested in thinking about these thoughts. It's like festivals are awesome, we love them, but like, what about maybe it's house parties. Maybe I'm just trying to advocate for house parties, playing with ideas of scale, playing with ideas of you can contact everyone, but why bother? Who knows? I want to be really surprised by the sort of next generation of artists responding to the current media environment by saying, we don't need to offer more visibility and more free content, Maybe it's going to be something totally different, and maybe it's going on and I don't see it yet.
I mean, in what sort of economies are you seeing developing around some of the musics, the regional musics that you're talking about? Was that a factor that you were kind of taking notice of? Are you seeing any new, I'm reluctant to say models, but are you seeing any new sort of processes around, making a living as a musician or DJ or, because obviously the sort of, you can't really sell units anymore. That's not really where it's at, and people are desperately looking for new revenue streams, if I can use that horrible expression. But what are you seeing any interesting patterns there?
Yeah, well, I'm going to give you a qualified no, but because the thing is, it's always. Music is often very interesting when money is far from the situation, and so. Like many examples of it kind of just is people messing around, and it happens to be publicly shareable, and that's the kind of that spirit of play, deeply embedded from the beginning, and especially the further I go from America or Western Europe, the less of a musical infrastructure there is, even for streaming and whatnot. So probably most of the musicians I talk to in this book are unknown and are not making money from their music. But I was taking a very specific stance, was saying, well, like, these kids in Cairo, what they're doing is interesting for all these different reasons. Economically, it's not so interesting. But I'm very, yeah.
I mean, it's, that term world music, which is, in a way that concept I see as sort of, in a way kind of developed in the late 60s and 70s. It was a sort of utopian idea around it maybe in the beginning, this idea of, field recordists gathering the world's music and presenting it. Now it seems quite tired, that idea, and especially in the light of the kind of musics you talk about, which seem very detached from what we think of as sort of traditional folk musics of the world, or they have interesting connections maybe, but they are largely electronic, digital. They're not the kind of things that people often think about in connection with regional musics. Do you think that, what sort of relationship are you seeing between the kind of younger kind of digital hybridizing artists and notions of traditional music making?
Yeah, well, on the one hand, there's like a kind of great democratization or great de-skilling when your musical production shifts to software and you can get a cheap computer and a bootleg copy of a program and actually make something that's shareable. So like that's kind of really, really thrilling and wonderful. And actually that's related to the sort of why there's often not money, because the bar to entry is much lower than ever before. You don't need 12 years of piano lessons. You know, you can kind of do some YouTube videos and find Fruity Loops and just go from there. But then throughout history, music evolves by people sort of versioning what's around them. You know, like there's this great, like all across Africa in the 1970s, people were just sort of transcribing different types of local music from, you know, thumb piano or whatever it is to electric guitar. Like so much of sort of African classics, it's like, well, they're just versioning these folk songs. So there's this, and one of the things and that's happening with the electronic stuff as well, you know, and except now that, you know, for a kid in Cairo, it'll be like, oh, they know Ahmed Adawaya, 1970s hyper-local Egyptian guy, but then they're also listening to Katy Perry, you know, and then they're also listening to Skrillex, and so this notion kind of sprawls out like that. Yeah.
What kind of hotspots are you seeing now? I mean, after the book, are you sort of like tuning into other places in the world that you maybe didn't get to during that period? Are you seeing interesting developments in other places?
Yeah, I mean, I would have loved to go to South Korea. I kind of have this notion of soul and Kpop as a kind of, you know, it's almost a few years into the future, you know, and even like Japanese, like that Japanese band which is 32 or more people whose name I forget. It's almost like, do you guys know? Yes, AKB48. Yes, there are all these like really nutso pop models, and they're almost always corporate. They have their managers, and they have this, but it's also, if you want to think about musical futures, I feel like stuff like that is you know, would be a nice counterpart to some of the things I discuss in my book. So,
I remember being in Tokyo in the late 90s, and people were talking then about there was some sort of coming Tokyo-Nairobi connection with electronic music. I'm still waiting for that. But, you know, it kind of makes you think of all the possible fusions that maybe have not quite happened or never quite happened. That's kind of tantalizing as well.
And that's it. You know, music is contamination. It proceeds by contamination. That's what everything is. When things concretize into a genre or even concretize into a star, that just means that there's like various forces holding the ordinary flow and influence at bay, the way I see it. You know, like in Guangzhou, China, you know, like hundreds of thousands of Africans, mostly from Nigeria, they're making, some of them want to be pop stars. Some of them are singing in Mandarin. You know, like it's happening always. So.
I mean, now, obviously, I mean, well, again, in the 90s, that's when globalization was really opening up, and it was a really, you know, exciting time. Now we're in a situation where the notion of migration has so many negative connotations, and obviously is kind of linked now with, you know, many thousands of personal tragedies and geopolitical nightmares. I mean, you talk in the book, I think, about the movement of digital music and files, almost in a similar, this kind of fragility of the passage of this material kind of through digital channels in a way that somehow kind of echoes the, you know, perilous passage of people, which is happening now. Do you want to talk a bit about that? These sort of the notion of migration now. It's quite a troubled notion at this moment, and what kind of impact you think the current state of migration and people's thinking about it is developing, and what music can draw from that in the present.
Yeah, it's like going back to that moment in the camp. I think, yeah, music's, I get sort of romantic about it, but music's openness is such a beautiful thing and such a beautiful model for engaging the world. You know, this idea of interpenetration without interference. Multiple people singing together, you can pick out individual instruments or individual tracks, and yet there's some sort of harmonious or discordant whole, but things like that are really wonderful. One of the reasons I brought up this example of the Moravia camp was, of course, I'm like, there's this beautiful musical moment, but I think music is, in this instance, a very nice way to just think about refugees and the movement of people from a totally different way, you know, so, which is to say that you go online, you look in a newspaper, it's very visual, it's like tragedy. You know, it's like a tragic individual or it's masses of people screaming. And there's this immediate, either like too much weird intimacy or too much distance. And so thinking about engaging the world away from you via listening, via something where you need to be somewhat passive and just kind of take it in, that to me right there, like, oh, okay, this is a different paradigm for how we can talk about these things. In a different way to even think about the movement of people, you know, because yeah, when it's constantly portrayed as a threat in the sort of most ludicrous ways, then the flip side of that is how everybody has loved some sort of musical travel in their life and expands outward. But it's a huge, huge topic, and it's incredibly, it's almost difficult to discuss because it's so personal. Like I know I'm not able to work with certain musicians because either they can no longer come into the States for fear of the situation, or because they can't leave the States because of visa tension. Like it's a really, really real thing. Yeah.
Reminds me, I wanted to ask you, did you pass through regions where music is banned for religious or other grounds? Is that something you've had experience of?
This is a good last, I think this is the last thing I'm going to say before. So I passed through a household where music is banned. And so this was spending time in Morocco. I was working in this kind of a music software as art project called Sufi plugins, like synthesizers hardwired to Arabic scales, things like that. And one of my great friends there, he's a banjoist and a vocalist, and he said, "Oh, you must come visit my family in South Morocco." Okay, great. So we go and we visit his family, and it turns out his father performs the call to prayer twice a day in this village. But he doesn't like music. He forbids music in his household. So I was there with Hassan, who's amazing. But in order for him to even just like play a song, we'd need to literally walk for 20 minutes up into the hillside to sort of go into this grotto. And so since I was working in this music software at the time, I said, oh, how can I like honor or like just respond to this very strange condition where I'm like, your son's the best musician in the country. And the father's like, not in my household, you punk. And so since the rest of the software tools are for making sound, and I said, well, I'm gonna have one, and it's gonna be called Devotion. And instead of producing sound 5 times a day out of respect for the Muslim call to prayer, it's just gonna lower the sound of your computer for 2 or 3 minutes and then raise it up again, you know. But because it's me, I'm like, okay, but there are going to be presets, and the presets are going to be agnostic, observant, fervent, apostate, and devout. You know, atheism is not an option. Like that's it.
Well, I mean, are there any? We can probably take a question from out there if anyone wants to chip in here. No. Oh yeah. True.
I was really struck by the tone that you were able to strike that was neither dystopian nor utopian about technology, and I was just wondering if you feel grateful in a way that you completed the book project before Trump, right? Because when you think about the way people would talk about music and technology like 15 years ago, there's this sort of cyber optimistic, tools are good. And that's obviously a problem because of neoliberalism and capitalism, and just music journalism becomes an apologetics for buying stuff. On the other hand, like in the way that you've talked about that pause and the respite, you're kind of refusing to be enervated and rattled and terrified, and you're also saying maybe the language of tragedy is not a good way to think about migration either. So I just wonder if you have more to say about timing and maybe letting go of affect in favor of something else, because that seemed to me really smart, but also very, like, I'm envious.
Yeah, that's great question. Yeah, thinking back, I am happy that I finished, just because the context, weirdly enough, has shifted in so many ways. And as much as I think that it's important to resist this notion that anything has shifted, I'm like, you know, like the emergency has been going on since 1492, since you can rewind, fast forward. So yeah, but seeing this very particularly like heightened level of kind of, it's like, you know, I feel like I'm like, oh, the postmodernism, like the left sort of failed postmodernism, but like suddenly it's embraced by the hard right, you know? I'm like, is this like what Baudrillard leads us to or something? You're just like, oh, very complicated. Yeah. And beyond that, I don't know what to say. And partly it's thinking through like a lot of this technology, like issues of technology and representation, speaking. I do, like the reason the reason I did this Sufi plugins project was because I'm like, it's not enough to critique it. It's not enough to like, misuse it like you do with a turntable or like you do with Autotune. But you actually do need to like, be generative about tools sometimes and put them out there and create them and sort of enter into that space really specifically. But you're dead on with works like Miriam's. I'm looking for people who are kind of suggesting different ways to think about this time and think about speech this time and even time in this moment. And so part of some other projects I'm doing, I'm thinking about like what is it like what's tragedy in a long scale look like, and how could you respond to that? And it's kind of more of a personal thing, but I have this idea that ritual is some idea of like, how can you engage in something timeless? It doesn't have to be a god, but something whether it's your daily coffee, it's like, what does that mean? And how does that enter into sort of what we understand is like more like contemporary art energies, which are much more about the here and the now, and like how can that be used to generate kind of new materials and new ways of sort of stepping back, slowing down, or just, sort of embodying the loop in a different way.
Sounds good. Do you have any? Is there going to be another book from you? Is that a format you want to
Oh yeah,
carry
definitely.
on? Yeah.
I mean, because it's terrible. It's like it's a crawling over broken glass in circles at night. But now that I've done it, I'm like, ooh, I kind of know how awful it is, and so I kind of want to do it again because I'll be a little bit more efficient about it the second time around, and it won't be quite as bad.
So you've got an idea in the works?
I do.
Top secret,
Top
clearly.
secret.
Okay. Well, we'll look forward to that. I would love to see a film based on that book, I have to say, a documentary type film. I think that would be a great subject. But you are in Knoxville to actually perform, we won't go into it now because I don't think we've got time, but you're performing work in connection with composer Julius Eastman.
Yes.
Yeah. So I would love to have had time to talk about him in relation to concepts of uprootedness, which I think could be quite interesting, but I don't think we probably have time to go into that.
Yeah. Tomorrow at 4:30, we're joined by pianist Emily Manzo, woohoo, David Friend, Aruj Aftab, and we're actually incredibly excited to do this. This is this funny project where when we began it, very few people knew who Julius Eastman was, and that was part of the impetus of the project. I'm like, well, let's work with this and let's kind of spread it around. But just in the past 6 months, he's had major articles in the New York Times, New Yorker, LA Times, and this sort of widespread awareness, which gives our piece a whole new context. Anyhow, it's beautiful. Everyone should come. Yeah,
no, I'm really looking forward to it. It's a fascinating character, and the music's amazing as well. So we look forward to that. Do check that out along with the other, incredible program here at Big Ears, and don't forget to check back for the other talks in this space happening today and later tomorrow. Thank you very much, Jace. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks very much.